The Holocaust stands as one of the most profound and horrific chapters in human history. It was the systematic, state-sponsored persecution and murder of 6 million European Jews, carried out by the Nazi German regime and its allies and collaborators across the continent. This was not a single event, but an evolving process, a descent into barbarity that unfolded step by step over 12 years, from 1933 to 1945. To understand the Holocaust is to confront a terrifying truth about how a modern, sophisticated society can engineer the destruction of an entire people, leveraging the full machinery of the state, its laws, its bureaucracy, its police, and its industries, toward a goal of annihilation. The scale is almost incomprehensible. By the end of the Second World War, nearly 2 out of every 3 Jews in Europe had been systematically killed through mass shootings, deliberate starvation, brutal ghettos, and specially designed killing centers equipped with gas chambers. This narrative will explore the origins, the mechanisms, the perpetrators, and the aftermath of this catastrophe, seeking to provide a clear and comprehensive account of how such a tragedy was able to occur. At the very foundation of the Holocaust lay a deep and virulent form of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism, which is the hatred of or prejudice against Jewish people, was not invented by the Nazis, but it became a central, organizing principle of their ideology and their worldview. The Nazi Party, led by Adolf Hitler, promoted a particularly toxic form of racial anti-Semitism. They falsely accused Jews of being responsible for Germany's most pressing social, economic, political, and cultural problems. In the aftermath of the First World War, a conflict that ended in a devastating defeat for Germany, many Germans were searching for someone to blame for the national humiliation and the subsequent economic chaos that gripped the Weimar Republic. The Nazis expertly channeled this anger and fear, scapegoating the Jewish population, whom they portrayed as a parasitic and malevolent force working against the German nation. They propagated the lie that Jews had somehow betrayed Germany, leading to its defeat in the war, and they played upon fears of communism and the economic shocks of the Great Depression to make their anti-Semitic message more appealing to a population in crisis. However, to fully grasp the nature of Nazi anti-Semitism, we must understand that it drew upon prejudices that were centuries old. Anti-Semitism has a long and tragic history in Europe, dating back to ancient times. During the Middle Ages, prejudices against Jews were primarily rooted in early Christian belief and thought, often centered on the malicious and false myth that Jews were collectively responsible for the death of Jesus. This religious-based suspicion and discrimination continued into early modern Europe, where leaders in many Christian kingdoms and states isolated Jews from most aspects of economic, social, and political life. This enforced exclusion, in turn, contributed to the development of stereotypes painting Jews as perpetual outsiders, a people who could never truly belong to the nations in which they lived. As European society became more secular in the 18th and 19th centuries, many of these legal restrictions were lifted, but this did not mean the end of anti-Semitism. Instead, it evolved. New forms emerged, including economic, nationalist, and racial anti-Semitism. In the 19th century, anti-Semites falsely claimed that Jews were responsible for the social and political ills brought about by modern, industrial society. Pseudo-scientific theories of race, eugenics, and social Darwinism were twisted to provide a false justification for these ancient hatreds, giving them a new, supposedly, scientific veneer. The Nazis absorbed all these elements, but they placed their primary emphasis on racial anti-Semitism. This is the discriminatory and fundamentally false idea that Jews are not merely members of a religious group, but constitute a separate and inferior race. The Nazi worldview was fundamentally race-based. They believed that the world was divided into distinct, competing races, and that some of these races were inherently superior to others. They considered Germans to be members of the supposedly superior Aryan race, which they believed was locked in a perpetual struggle for existence with other, inferior races. In this twisted hierarchy, they labeled the so-called Jewish race as the most inferior and the most dangerous of all. According to Nazi ideology, Jews were an existential threat that needed to be completely removed from German society. Otherwise, they would permanently corrupt and destroy the German people. It is crucial to understand that the Nazis defined Jews by race, not by religious practice. This meant that their definition included many individuals who identified as Christians, who had converted, or who did not practice Judaism at all. Their identity, in the eyes of the Nazi state, was determined by their ancestry, a concept brutally codified into law through the infamous Nuremberg race laws of 1935, which stripped German Jews of their citizenship and legally defined who was considered a Jew. The Holocaust was not confined to Germany alone. It was a Nazi-German initiative that took place throughout German and Axis-controlled Europe. It affected nearly all of Europe's Jewish population, which in 1933 numbered approximately 9 million people. The process began in Germany itself after Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor in January 1933. Almost immediately, the Nazi regime, which grandly referred to itself as the Third Reich, began to systematically exclude Jews from German economic, political, social, and cultural life. Jewish civil servants were dismissed from their jobs, Jewish-owned businesses were boycotted, and a flood of discriminatory laws were enacted to marginalize and impoverish the Jewish community. Throughout the 1930s, the regime increasingly pressured Jews to emigrate, stripping them of their assets and making life in Germany increasingly unbearable. But the Nazi persecution of Jews soon spread far beyond Germany's borders. Throughout the 1930s, Nazi Germany pursued an aggressive and expansionist foreign policy, a policy that culminated in the outbreak of the Second World War in Europe in 1939. This pre-war and wartime territorial expansion brought millions more Jewish people under German control. It began in 1938 and 1939 with the annexation of Austria, the Sudetenland, and the occupation of the Czech lands. Then, on September 1, 1939, Nazi Germany invaded Poland, triggering a global conflict. Over the next 2 years, Germany invaded and occupied much of the European continent, from France in the west to vast stretches of Western Soviet Union in the east. Nazi Germany further extended its control by forming alliances with the governments of Italy, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria, and by creating puppet states in Slovakia and Croatia. Together, these countries constituted the European members of the Axis alliance. By 1942, as a result of annexations, invasions, occupations, and alliances, Nazi Germany controlled most of Europe and parts of North Africa. This control enabled the implementation of the Holocaust on a continental scale, bringing harsh, discriminatory policies and, ultimately, mass murder to Jewish civilians from the Atlantic coast to the depths of Russia. The persecution inflicted upon Jewish people by Nazi Germany and its allies and collaborators was not a monolithic experience. It took many forms and evolved in its brutality over time. Between 1933 and 1945, a wide range of anti-Jewish policies and measures were implemented, and these varied from place to place. Not all Jews experienced the Holocaust in the same way, but in all instances, millions were persecuted simply because they were identified as Jewish. Throughout German-controlled and aligned territories, the persecution manifested in several devastating ways. It began with legal discrimination, epitomized by the Nuremberg race laws, which institutionalized racism and stripped Jews of their rights and citizenship. This was accompanied by various forms of public identification and exclusion, including a constant barrage of anti-Semitic propaganda, organized boycotts of Jewish-owned businesses, public humiliations, and eventually the obligatory wearing of a badge, often the Jewish star, sewn onto clothing to mark and isolate them. Organized violence was another key tool. The most notorious pre-war example was Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, which occurred in November 1938, during which synagogues were burned, Jewish businesses and homes were vandalized and looted, and tens of thousands of Jewish men were arrested and sent to concentration camps. But there were also countless isolated incidents and other pogroms, violent riots, targeting Jewish communities. Physical displacement was a central feature of the persecution. The perpetrators used forced emigration, resettlement, expulsion, deportation, and ghettoization to physically uproot Jewish individuals and communities from their homes. Internment followed, as Jews were forced into overcrowded, sealed ghettos, or later, into concentration camps and forced labor camps, where countless numbers died from starvation, disease, and other inhumane, deliberately cruel conditions. Widespread theft and plunder were systematic. The confiscation of Jews' property, personal belongings, valuables, and even their homes was a key part of the Holocaust, enriching the Nazi state, its officials, and often their non-Jewish neighbors. Finally, forced labor was imposed, with Jews compelled to work in service of the Axis war effort or for the enrichment of Nazi organizations, the military, and private businesses. Many Jews died as a direct result of these brutal policies. But before 1941, the systematic, industrial-scale mass murder of all Jews was not yet the official policy of the Nazi state. That horrific final step was yet to come. This final step was what the Nazi leadership referred to as the final solution to the Jewish question. This term, Endlösung der Judenfrage in German, was the bureaucratic euphemism for the deliberate, organized, and systematic mass murder of European Jews. It was the last stage of the Holocaust, implemented between 1941 and 1945. While many Jews had already been killed in the preceding years, the vast majority of the 6 million Jewish victims were murdered during this period. The Nazis committed this mass murder on an unprecedented scale, primarily using two main methods: mass shootings and asphyxiation with poison gas. The mass shootings were perpetrated on a scale never before seen. After Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, special units known as Einsatzgruppen, along with order police battalions and Waffen-SS units, began carrying out mass shootings of local Jewish civilians. At first, these units targeted Jewish men of military age, but by August 1941, they had escalated to massacring entire Jewish communities, men, women, and children alike. These atrocities were often conducted in broad daylight, in full view and earshot of local residents, creating a pervasive atmosphere of terror. The process was horrifically methodical. The units would enter a town, round up all the Jewish civilians, and march them to the outskirts. There, they would be forced to dig a mass grave or were taken to pits prepared in advance. Then, they would be shot, their bodies falling into the communal pit. These mass shooting operations took place in more than 1,500 cities, towns, and villages across Eastern Europe. Sometimes, the perpetrators used specially designed mobile gas vans, where victims were locked in the airtight back and suffocated by carbon monoxide exhaust piped from the engine. Key killing sites for these shootings included Fort 9 in Kovna, the Rumbula and Bykerniki forests in Riga, and Mali Trosnitz near Minsk. It is estimated that as many as 2 million Jews were murdered in these mass shootings or in the gas vans in the territories seized from Soviet forces. The second method, and the one that would come to symbolize the industrial nature of the Holocaust, was the use of stationary killing centers. In late 1941, the Nazi regime began building specially designed facilities in German-occupied Poland for the sole purpose of efficient, assembly line murder. In English, these are sometimes called extermination camps or death camps. Nazi Germany operated 5 such primary killing centers: Chelmno, Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, and Auschwitz-Birkenau. The primary means of murder at these camps was poisonous gas, typically Zyklon B or carbon monoxide, released into sealed gas chambers. To transport Jews to these centers from every corner of Europe, German authorities, with the help of their allies and collaborators, used the extensive European railroad system. They deliberately disguised their murderous intentions, referring to the transports as resettlement actions or evacuation transports. In English, we most often call them deportations. The conditions on these deportation transports were themselves a form of torture. Jews of all ages were forced, at gunpoint, into overcrowded railcars, which were often just freight cars used for cattle or cargo. They were given no food, no water, no bathrooms, no heat in the winter, and no medical care. People were forced to stand for days on end, and many died en route from the sheer inhumanity of the conditions. Upon arrival at the killing center, the vast majority of those on the transport were subjected to a brutal and rapid selection process. German SS doctors would quickly glance at the lines of people and, with a wave of the hand, decide who was fit enough for a temporary reprieve through forced labor, and who would be sent immediately to the gas chambers. The elderly, the sick, women, and especially young children were almost always sent directly to their deaths. They were told they were going to showers for disinfection, a cruel lie meant to prevent panic. They were forced to undress, and then herded into the gas chambers, which were disguised as shower rooms. The doors were sealed, and the poison gas was released. Their belongings were then sorted through by special units of Jewish prisoners, known as Sonderkommandos, who were forced to aid in this ghastly process, removing the bodies and disposing of them in mass graves or burning them in large crematoria. Nearly 2.7 million Jewish men, women, and children were murdered at these 5 killing centers. A critical part of the process that led to the final solution was the creation of ghettos. Ghettos were sealed areas within cities or towns where German occupiers forced Jews to live in overcrowded and squalid conditions. German authorities often enclosed these areas with walls, barbed wire, or other barriers, and guards were posted to prevent Jews from leaving without permission. Some ghettos existed for years, but others were temporary, existing only for months, weeks, or even days as holding sites prior to deportation to the killing centers. German officials first created ghettos in 1939 and 1940 in German-occupied Poland, with the 2 largest located in the cities of Warsaw and Lodz. Following the attack on the Soviet Union in 1941, they established many more across Eastern Europe. The original purpose of the ghettos was to isolate and control the large local Jewish populations. They concentrated Jewish residents from a city and its surrounding region into a confined, manageable space. Later, Jews from other parts of Europe, including Germany itself, were also deported to these ghettos. Life inside the ghettos was miserable and relentlessly dangerous. There was never enough food, leading to mass starvation. Sanitation was appalling, and diseases like typhus ran rampant with little to no medical care available. Hundreds of thousands of people died from these deliberate conditions, as well as from exposure to extreme weather and exhaustion from forced labor. The Germans also murdered imprisoned Jews through brutal, arbitrary violence, beatings, torture, and random shootings. Despite this unimaginable suffering, Jews in the ghettos sought to maintain a sense of dignity and community. Clandestine schools, libraries, communal welfare services, and religious institutions operated in secret. There were also courageous acts of spiritual resistance, such as the secret documentation of life in the Warsaw Ghetto in an archive known as the Oneg Shabbat. And there was armed resistance, most famously the Warsaw Ghetto uprising in 1943, where a small, poorly armed group of Jewish fighters held off German forces for nearly a month. Beginning in 1941 and 1942, the Germans began the process of liquidating the ghettos, which meant murdering the residents en masse and dissolving the ghetto structures. This liquidation was a key component of the final solution. The majority of ghetto residents were murdered in mass shootings at nearby sites or, more commonly, were deported by rail to the killing centers. The responsibility for carrying out the Holocaust and the final solution rests with a vast and complex network of individuals and institutions. At the very highest level, Adolf Hitler inspired, ordered, approved, and supported the genocide of Europe's Jews. He provided the ideological drive and the ultimate authority. However, he did not act alone, nor did he lay out a single, detailed blueprint. Other high-ranking Nazi leaders were the ones who directly coordinated, planned, and implemented the mass murder. Key figures among them were Hermann Göring, who early on gave written authorization for planning a total solution to the Jewish question, Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS and the chief architect of the genocide, Reinhard Heydrich, who chaired the Wannsee Conference where the coordination of the final solution was discussed, and Adolf Eichmann, who managed the logistics of the deportations. But the Holocaust required the participation of millions of ordinary Germans and other Europeans. Without their extensive involvement, the genocide on such a scale would have been logistically impossible. Nazi leaders relied upon German institutions and organizations, other Axis powers, local bureaucracies, and countless individuals. Key German institutions involved included the Nazi Party itself, the SA stormtroopers, and most significantly, the SS and its various police branches, such as the Sicherheitsdienst, SD, the Gestapo, and the Order Police. The German military, the Wehrmacht, often provided crucial logistical support and sometimes participated directly in massacres. The German national railway system was essential, organizing and running the deportation trains to the camps. The German civil service, the criminal justice system, and even businesses, insurance companies, and banks all played roles in disenfranchising, dispossessing, and profiting from the persecution of the Jews. Countless German soldiers, policemen, civil servants, lawyers, judges, engineers, and doctors made conscious choices to implement the regime's murderous policies. Ordinary Germans also participated, sometimes by cheering on humiliation, by denouncing Jewish neighbors for breaking racist laws, or by buying, taking, or looting Jewish property at bargain prices. Their motivations were a complex and dark mix of careerism, fear, greed, political idealism, and deeply ingrained anti-Semitism. Nazi Germany did not perpetrate the Holocaust in a vacuum. It relied heavily on the help of its allies and collaborators. The term allies here refers to the Axis countries officially allied with Germany, such as Italy, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria, and collaborationist regimes like Vichy France. These governments often passed their own anti-Semitic legislation and actively cooperated with German goals, including rounding up their own Jewish citizens for deportation. Collaborators also refers to regimes and organizations that cooperated with German authorities in an official or semi-official capacity. This included local police forces in occupied countries like the Netherlands and France, who helped arrest and intern Jews. In Eastern Europe, local auxiliary units, made up of military and police officials and civilians, often participated voluntarily in the massacres of their Jewish neighbors. Beyond official collaboration, individuals across Europe, with no governmental affiliation, contributed to the Holocaust in deadly ways. The most common was denunciation, revealing Jews' hiding places or exposing their false Christian identities to the authorities, an act that almost always meant death. Others profited directly, moving into vacated Jewish homes or taking over their businesses. And many, many more were simply bystanders, contributing through their inaction and indifference to the suffering of their fellow human beings. While the Holocaust specifically refers to the systematic destruction of 6 million Jews, the Nazi regime also targeted and murdered millions of other victims in its campaign to create a racial empire. The Nazis classified Jews as the priority enemy, but they also ruthlessly targeted other groups they perceived as threats to the health, unity, and security of the German people. The first to be targeted were political opponents, including communists, socialists, trade unionists, and anyone suspected of opposing the Nazi regime. These were the first inmates of the concentration camp system. The Nazis also targeted Germans whose behavior was deemed socially deviant, including men accused of homosexuality, habitual criminals, and so-called asocials, such as vagabonds, beggars, and alcoholics. Tens of thousands of these individuals were incarcerated. People with disabilities were horrifically victimized, first through a program of forced sterilization, and then, once the war began, through a secret murder program euphemistically named T4, or the euthanasia program, which saw tens of thousands of disabled people gassed in specially designated facilities, serving as a grim precursor to the killing centers of the Holocaust. The Nazi regime also employed extreme measures against groups they considered racial or ideological enemies. The Roma and Sinti people, often referred to as gypsies, were targeted for genocide, and hundreds of thousands were murdered. The Nazis viewed Slavic peoples, particularly Poles and Soviet citizens, as racially inferior. They targeted the Polish intelligentsia and elites for murder in an effort to decapitate Polish society and reduce the rest of the population to a slave labor force. Soviet prisoners of war were treated with unparalleled brutality. Out of approximately 5.7 million Soviet soldiers captured, an estimated 3.3 million died in German custody from starvation, disease, and deliberate mistreatment. Jehovah's Witnesses were also persecuted and incarcerated for their refusal to swear allegiance to the state or serve in the military. The Holocaust finally ended in May 1945 with the total military defeat of Nazi Germany by the major Allied powers, Great Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union. As Allied forces fought their way across Europe in a series of major offensives, they began to overrun the Nazi concentration camps. What they discovered there shocked the world and revealed the full, horrifying extent of the Nazi crimes. The liberating soldiers encountered emaciated, starving survivors and piles of corpses that the retreating SS had not had time to dispose of. The Allies also encountered the survivors of the death marches. In the final months of the war, as the Soviet army advanced from the east, the SS had evacuated concentration camp inmates from camps near the front, forcing them to march on foot, under brutal conditions, deeper into Germany. These marches were characterized by extreme violence, and thousands of prisoners died from exhaustion, exposure, or were shot dead by their guards. But liberation, while a salvation from almost certain death, did not bring closure or an end to suffering. For the survivors, the aftermath was a new kind of struggle. Many had lost their entire families, parents, spouses, children, siblings, and faced the traumatic, often lifelong task of grieving for millions of individual losses. They had to confront the devastation of their communities, which in many cases had been completely erased. Many found they could not or would not return to their pre-war homes due to persistent, violent anti-Semitism and the hostility of their former neighbors. In the immediate post-war period, hundreds of thousands of Jewish survivors found themselves living in displaced persons camps, set up by the Allies in Germany, Austria, and Italy. There, they had to wait, sometimes for years, before they were able to immigrate to new homes in the United States, the newly established State of Israel, and other countries around the world. Despite the Nazis' determined effort to murder every Jew in Europe, some did manage to survive the Holocaust. Survival was always against impossible odds and was only possible because of an extraordinary combination of circumstances, quick choices, help from others, and sheer luck. Some Jews survived by escaping German-controlled Europe before the war or before the deportations began. Hundreds of thousands emigrated in the 1930s, while others, like approximately 200,000 Polish Jews, fled east into the interior of the Soviet Union after the German invasion. A smaller number survived inside German-controlled Europe itself, often with the help of rescuers. These rescuers were non-Jews who took grave, life-threatening risks to help Jews survive. They hid Jews in attics, cellars, and secret rooms. They procured false identification papers that offered a protective Christian identity, and they provided food and supplies, often at great personal cost. Other Jews survived by joining partisan resistance movements in the forests of Eastern Europe, engaging in guerrilla warfare against the German occupiers. And finally, a small number managed, against all odds, to survive the horrors of imprisonment in concentration camps and ghettos, their bodies and spirits pushed to the absolute limit of human endurance. The legacy of the Holocaust is a heavy one, a permanent scar on human history. The world has spent the decades since 1945 struggling to come to terms with the sheer horror of this genocide, to remember the 6 million Jewish victims and the millions of others, to bring at least some of the perpetrators to justice, and to learn the lessons of this dark period. The Holocaust stands as the ultimate warning of where hatred, prejudice, and indifference can lead. It teaches us about the fragility of civilization, the dangers of state-sponsored propaganda and racism, and the critical importance of defending human rights and human dignity for all people, everywhere. The memory of those who perished, and the stories of those who survived, compel us to remain vigilant, to speak out against intolerance, and to ensure that such a catastrophe is never allowed to happen again.